Great, thank you for that. I'll be able to. Do you want my microphone while you introduce this section?
Right, thank you. Okay, today's seminar is jointly sponsored by IRES, the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability, and the UBC Clean Energy Research Center. Thanks for that. And I'd like to begin acknowledging that we are on the land of the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the Musqueam, Squamish, Stolo, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Today's speaker is Dr. Naomi Zimmerman, who leads the IRES lab, the Integrated Research in Energy, Air, Climate, and Health. Dr. Zimmerman is an assistant professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering and a Canada Research Chair in Sustainability at UBC. This follows her PhD at the University of Toronto and a postdoc at Carnegie Mellon. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Zimmerman.
Great, thanks so much. Just give me a second here to reattach this wireless mic. So thanks so much for those of you who came out in person. That's great, and it's so great to see so many of you on Zoom. I think there's 30 of you. That's fantastic. So thanks so much for coming out. So today we're going to talk about something that maybe you're like, oh, mechanical engineering. It's going to be quite technical. Actually, we're not going to talk about anything particularly technical today, because I wanted to have a talk that I thought would cater nicely to the sort of interdisciplinary research that folks in IRES and the Clean Energy Research Center are all about. And so I work a lot with lower cost air quality sensors. And so I thought that I would share some of my thoughts and insights on understanding air quality with lower cost sensors. So we're going to talk about, highlight some of the research. We're going to talk about some of the technical considerations. I'm also going to talk about some of the community considerations as well for impactful research, some of my own lessons learned and pain points and things along the way. Go. Okay, so low cost sensors. For those of you in the room, how many of you are familiar with this concept, low cost air quality sensors? Few of you. How many of you became familiar with it because of the pandemic? Before the pandemic? All right, so most of you are aware of this, which is great. Although a lot more interest in these lately, right? After people talking about, carrying particulate matter sensors around or CO2 sensors around. So essentially, for those who are not as familiar, a low-cost sensor is a cheaper tool to measure air pollutants. It's used by citizens and scientists alike. And here you'll note the cost range is anywhere from tens to thousands of dollars. So I often refer to the tools that I work with as lower cost sensors, because from a research context, they are much, much, much cheaper than the sort of equivalent research grade tools. But we work with ones that are on the sort of higher end of the low cost sensor spectrum. So in the order of a few $1,000s. So ideally, it would be great is that as a community, we come up with better definitions of this versus just low or lower cost, because it certainly can be quite variable. And there has been enormous growth in popularity and attention in the past decade about these sensors. So for example, two headlines that I found to be quite charming. One is the New York Times article that suggests that people bring low-cost air pollution sensors to Burning Man. It seemed a little counterintuitive to me. You go burn a giant effigy, but make sure you bring your personal air quality monitor with you. And even in 2020, the purple air particulate matter sensor ended up on the Washington Post 2020 holiday gift guide. So that's sort of the level of ubiquitousness that these tools have reached in the last even handful of years. So what can we measure with low-cost air quality sensors? We can measure some criteria, air contaminants, or things that are regulated, like particulate matter, or PM 2.5, which are particles that have a diameter of 2.5 micron or smaller, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, ozone, SO2, volatile organic compounds, that sort of thing. And there are some sensors that can measure what I call climate pollutants, so CO2 and methane. I did want to note that some of these measurement approaches are more successful than others. You'll see a lot of marketing about, oh, total VOC sensor, and I've yet to be convinced that any of these actually are particularly functional. But some of the ones for particulate matter, CO, tend to work fairly well. So some work better than others. I also wanted to mention that if you're in the space of looking for a low-cost sensor, it can be really overwhelming because hundreds or possibly even thousands of companies exist now that sell these low-cost sensors. However, actually, a lot of them rely on the same internal components and operating theory. So there's really only a handful of manufacturers of the base components that go into a low-cost sensor, and they use things like either a metal oxide sensor, electrochemical sensor, or a nephelometer or an optical particle counter. So it can be overwhelming, but if you dig into the actual tool behind the sensor, it can be sort of illuminating. So what can we do with low-cost sensing data? So at the community scale and in initial research deployments, I would say the focus has primarily been on reporting concentration data and overlaying it on maps. So do any of you actually own a purple air monitor in the room? No one owns, well, Lynn has one, right? So if you went to the purple air dashboard, right, you could go find your sensor and you could click on it and it gives you, some colors and a time series of concentrations over time. So it's giving you a concentration parameter. That's sort of it, and maybe some coarse scale of how bad it is on green to red. So in this context, a low-cost sensor is really a supplement to regulatory monitoring networks or a means of bringing personal air quality monitoring into the home. In the research community, at the very beginning, there was a lot of focus on calibration and validation techniques, right? There's no free lunch except for at the IRES seminar. So there are trade-offs with these technologies. There are certain things around their operating principles that lead to interferences, that lead to drift, failure over time. And so the research community is sort of saying, okay, well, before we're going to adopt these for research purposes, we really got to understand how well they're working. I am not going to talk about that today because I spent a lot of time looking at those questions. But if you wanted to read some papers about different machine learning or different mechanistic algorithms that we've built to calibrate some of these, there are certainly some papers that you can read about this for fun on the weekend. But just sort of keep it in the back of your mind that that's something that is very, very important, but not going to be the focus of today. So I want to bring this back to, now we've calibrated them. That's good. We feel like as researchers, maybe we can trust the data from a low-cost sensor. But what are some key considerations for a meaningful low-cost sensor, I'm going to call it LCS, deployment? So from my perspective, and everything you're going to get is my perspective, highly biased. But for me, generating concentration data on its own, that does bring value. It can be informative to know some number. But from my perspective, shifting focus on what we do with the data or what it means has potentially enormous untapped value that we haven't really been looking at. So if we think about deployments in our communities, can we do more robust measurements of the sources and impacts of air pollution, characterize those sources in better detail? Can we assess any policy or technical interventions a little bit quicker with real-world based deployments? These are questions that I've been thinking about. This also inherently requires considerations around stakeholder engagement. So if you care about interventions, you probably should be talking to community members, policy experts, and also if you're going to do real-world based low-cost sensor research, you got to have all these technical considerations as well. So what does it take to put something on a light pole anyway? That's trivial. It is not trivial to put something on a light pole, even at UBC. I have whole contracts signed with campus and community planning that included things like considering the arrival experience of students at UBC to make sure that they're not, too cluttered with sensors and research. Another aspect is that if you're going to do work with these sensors in sort of a real world or community context, then the knowledge dissemination is also key. How are findings going to be shared back? And when are those findings going to be shared back? So those are some things we're going to look at today. So for the outline today, I'm going to highlight some of the group's real-world based air quality research with low-cost sensors. We'll take sort of a brief look at 3 different projects. So one was on our traffic and air quality sensor integration on campus. Have any of you seen any air pollution sensors on campus? They're out there. Another on wildfire smoke that we did in 2020, and one on indoor air quality and air exchange rates in India. And within these examples, I'm going to talk about work that's important to build a community of practice on technical considerations, and also considerations for knowledge translation with some examples, which for someone like me, so trained in engineering, is not inherently obvious to someone like me the best ways of doing this. So we've sort of tried our best and working at trying to improve this over time. Before I talk about some of the research examples, I wanted to give you a bit of a sort of flavor for what we do at the lab. So when I started at UBC a little over 4 years ago now, I came into the task, got to give the lab a name. So I called it the Integrated Research in Energy, Air, Climate, and Health Lab because I figured that has to cover my whole career, right? It's a lot of different things. But really what the lab is all about is research on the development and application of real-world based tools to assess the impact of policy and technology decisions or changes on air pollution and climate outcomes. So unlike most people who do experimental research, I have essentially zero lab footprint at UBC. We do all of our work in the community. I do have, I'll show you in a couple slides, a mobile air quality van. So sort of the extent of my footprint on UBC is a parking space, but I do not have sort of a four-walled, rigid lab space because we're really focused on taking data out in the community. And so we're interested in this cycle about things like human activity, if you look at the top of the circle, which inherently creates emissions, which affects climate change and air quality. To understand those effects, we rely on measurement. So I'm mostly focused on the mobile monitoring aspect and sensor networks. And then we can see how that human activity might change if there's technology changes that are implemented, behavior changes, or policy changes. Those are that's sort of broad themes of what the lab is all about. I'm going to try to hide this. Go Irish. Okay, there we go. All right, so just a brief overview. Sorry, this is a kind of busy slide about some of the tools. So the sensors that I'm going to show you today are just one of many potential sensors. It's just ones that I've happened to have been working with for some time that I have some confidence in. But I work for our lower cost sensors with the remote air quality monitoring platform, or the RAMPs. We have about 28 of them right now, and funding to grow the network out to about 100. So pretty substantial network of sensors that we could deploy. They do measure many of those pollutants that I had measured, and they also measure temperature and relative humidity. Some of them also measure wind speed and direction as well. They're weatherproof, they're wireless, they're battery powered, or you can also install solar panels with them. So they're, pretty nice to work with, fairly easy. Once you get that light bulb permission, you're sort of good to go. And so here are some pictures of them. So there is a PhD student who's co-supervised by myself and Professor Amanda Jang, who's in IRES. Rinmoy in the top, who's working with setting up some of the ramps for his fieldwork in India. And below, some photos of them on some railways, or rails at the Clark Drive site at Metro Vancouver, where we do some of our initial calibration. So that partnership with Metro Vancouver, very, very important, because co-location with a regulatory site, especially one right beside a busy roadway, is very, very helpful for calibration of these sensors. And some nice faces of people who work in my lab on these sensors. I also just wanted to give a shout out as well to essentially the polar opposite of a low-cost sensor, which is our portable laboratory for understanding human-made emissions, or the Plume van. This is on the order of million plus dollars of infrastructure that's going into this, but it's a nice complementary tool that we have available for, say, a static air quality network. If you want to go check it out, it's parked in the parking lot of Rusty Hut, or in between the civil and mechanical engineering buildings. And normally Dabby's in there working away, so you can go say hi. I'll give you a little tour. Okay, so some themes of the lab related to those examples I'm going to show are transportation systems, indoor-outdoor exchange, and emerging source characterization. So we're going to look for one example of real-world emission factors in the transportation systems. For indoor-outdoor exchange, we'll look at an example of some work in progress on ventilation and air exchange rate estimates. And then for emerging source characterization, also sort of in the context of ventilation, we'll look at some wildfire smoke with low-cost sensors. So let's start with the first example. So we have intelligent traffic solutions and air quality integrations. So there's actually 8 air quality sensors out on campus right now at where all the little red dots are. And there's some red dots that have these sort of yellow squares around them. And at those same sites is also a sort of smart traffic sensor. This is a project that we started last year in partnership with Rogers, who's building a 5G test bed on campus. And so we've been collecting air quality data for almost a year now at these different sites. And so the focus of this work is trying to essentially do better work on source characterization of traffic specifically, not just the total concentration of air pollutants. And we're doing that because of having this advanced sort of traffic sensor data available at the same time. So on the left there is a picture of output from one of these traffic sensors. And essentially what it does, it will tell you how many cars, buses, trucks are going by at any given time. It does a lane by lane analysis for you as well, so you can know whether a vehicle is turning, going straight through. Pretty much vehicles just turn and go straight through. Those are the two things. And it also uses anonymized video processing to count total numbers of pedestrians and cyclists. So if you have walked by University and Westbrook Mall, you presumably would have been counted as a pedestrian. If you biked by, counted as a cyclist. If you're on a bus that happened to go by, you'd be counted as a bus. And this is really helpful for us because we can know that if we have a certain amount of traffic and we try to isolate the vehicle-specific component from the low-cost sensor data, we can have some sense of sort of what the fleet characteristics are at UBC. But this is a little bit complicated. So this is, we're not going to go into tons of detail about this, but it is sort of a technical approach that we've had to deal with. And so I wanted to just emphasize that vehicle emissions and traffic counts are not essentially directly linked. So why is that? And really it's because what you measure is a function of a number of different things. So measured concentration by your sensor in the middle is going to vary depending on what's happening by time of day. If there's atmospheric chemistry that's happening, reactions with sunlight, for example, that at the sort of regional scale is going to influence your measured concentration. You might have other sources that are coming in, again, regional scale, wildfire smoke, for example, that's going to influence your measured concentration. Wind direction will also influence whether or not your sensor is actually measuring the vehicles you want to measure. And then also vehicle age or vehicle tuning status or type of vehicle. All of these things will also influence what you measure. Not all vehicles emit equally. So we've taken a lot of time to try to optimize this approach to deal with these challenges. So essentially, I'm not going to go into any equations or algorithms or details for what we've done, but we've worked really hard to isolate vehicle-specific emissions. So the way we're doing this is with a dynamic removal of the baseline concentrations. So essentially, the goal there is to eliminate other sources or the vast majority of other sources and atmospheric chemistry from the data. And the benefit of this is that effects of non-traffic sources and chemistry typically happen on much slower timescales than, say, specific vehicles going by. And so what you're left with when you have this algorithm that's sort of trained based on traffic counting, right? It should identify the baseline and the total signal is the same if there's no traffic, vice versa, is that you can be left with something like this, where you can see essentially on the top in the gray, those are the total truck counts for about 3 weeks of data. And then on the bottom, sort of mirrored, the scale is inverted, right? You start at 20 and go up to 0 for your nitrogen oxide concentrations. That would be after removal of the baseline. And so what you can see there is that in terms of removing of the sort of regional effects, it's pretty effective, right? We don't have high NO unless there are trucks present, right? But not every truck is a high emitter of NO. So we've dealt with the sort of some of those aspects. And the second aspect of this is developing models for the relationship between vehicle counts, wind direction, and measured concentrations. And really what we're doing there is converting the data into an emission factor. We do have wind speed, wind direction data as well that goes into this. So essentially, an emission factor is a pollutant that's been normalized by activity level. And you can actually infer kilograms of fuel burned based on total CO2 concentrations. So essentially, you can normalize for those dilution effects and only isolate vehicle emissions you're picking up. If you have a pollutant and you have CO2, you can essentially do some magic and convert that into per kilogram fuel burn. You might be wondering, okay, that's great if it's a burning gasoline or diesel and it's detectable. So how do we know what fraction of the fleet is actually emitting emissions? If we know the wind is blowing towards our sensor and we're not picking up a certain amount of emissions, we essentially get a sort of proxy of the fraction of the fleet that is being detected or has a detectable emission factor, which is really useful for trends over time, right? So if there are changes to the fleet, ideally we would see the detectable emission factors of gasoline and diesel vehicles going down over time if, say, EVs went up. And we also have some data from some partnerships with a company called Downtown.ai that taps into the TransLink API and tells us the types of buses that are going by, whether or not it's a diesel hybrid, whether or not it's one of the trolley buses. And so we can also try to control for that. So we worked on developing some algorithms to deal with this. We also wanted to do the public outreach side of things. So you just saw one of the sensors, and now you can see someone walking up and scanning a QR code in front of those sensors, which also initiates a text message-based conversation with the sensor to get a sense of what people think about air pollution, how they'd like to see the data displayed back to them, those sorts of considerations. And so we tried to, have this idea of public outreach in mind, in addition to sort of our own gains of understanding these vehicle emission factors. We did sort of build some of these tools to make sure the data could get out there. So you can have this text message-based conversation, and it hyperlinks to a traffic-related air pollution dashboard, essentially. Or it will hyperlink eventually. The dashboard's about to launch fairly soon. Right now, it just links to a landing page, but it will ultimately lead to a dashboard like this one, which I thought was pretty cool. So Surya, my postdoctoral fellow, Surya Julipala, has been developing this, and I'm very impressed by what he's been developing. So if we think about this in terms of the pillars of how the work was designed, in terms of emphasizing data interpretation, this project has that, right? Convert raw low-cost sensor data into vehicle-specific emissions, try to link air quality to the source. Stakeholder engagement, this was a partnership with Rogers, so the industry partner engagement was sort of baked into the research study. But we really prioritized public engagement through public-facing dashboards and engagement. In terms of knowledge dissemination, we've been building dashboards, landing pages, interactive videos, those sorts of things. And then just some logistical considerations that go into this sort of work. Contract with UBC to obtain light pole permissions, grab ethical approval for all surveying, working relationships with Metro Vancouver to conduct co-location. There's a lot that sort of goes on behind the scenes to make some of this happen. Even renting like a scissor lift to mount them. Who knew? I never thought I'd have to rent scissor lifts, but here we are. Okay, that one I have the most detail on, and we'll do some brief other examples on air exchange rate and infiltration coefficient. So I wanted to mention that in addition to on campus, we've put sensors all over the place. We've used them in rural households in India. We've used them in the GF Strong Rehabilitation Center, daycares across Metro Vancouver. We had some in the hospitals in the Fraser Health region as part of the COVID-19 work. So I'm just going to show a couple highlights of that. So we'll start with the households in India. Rinmoy and Sakshi, two PhD students in my group, took a bunch of these ramps to the village of Unnao in Uttar Pradesh, and they had them up for about 2 months, the very end of 2019. And here, in terms of looking at source characterization, what they did was, this is a time series, and it's very, very small to read, but essentially you're looking at a time series of pollutant concentration, and there's sort of a faint gray bar there. That's the cooking period. So when you see cooking emissions, you see very high spikes in pollutant concentration. I will point out that in the photo, there is one of the ramps mounted against the wall, and then at the bottom, there is a little cook stove there. So we're sort of sampling those cooking emissions, which we know are essentially the dominant source of exposure to air pollution in some of these communities. And so in terms of emphasizing interpretation, Rinmoy has been converting these into air exchange rates, or AERs, by essentially fitting lines to these decay curves and trying to promote things like looking at variability in different air exchange rates across different households and based on different pollutant types, combined with, again, surveying to understand the nature of these buildings, and essentially try to make the data more interpretable or potentially more actionable, linking it to something modifiable. How can we improve the ventilation in this space? I will mention as well, this was work with Amanda Deng as well. Another example of how we've looked at air infiltration with these sensors is in daycares across Metro Vancouver. So we put a bunch of sensors up indoors and outdoors at a bunch of daycares, about 16 in total in 2020. There was a 6-day wildfire episode during this deployment. And so we tried to use the sensors to look again at assessments of ventilation characteristics and wildfire smoke infiltration. So this work is still ongoing, but I just want to emphasize here some sort of preliminary results where you can see here, this is indoor concentrations at a number of different sort of de-identified daycares. And you can see the blue bars are the wildfire periods and the red bars are the non-wildfire periods. So we are seeing substantial differences in indoor concentrations for this vulnerable population during the wildfires. And we also see, this interesting metric of, ventilation. If there's children and people at the daycare when it's open between about 7 and 6 p.m., do we see indoor increases in CO2? Yes, we do. However, the CO2, interestingly, they were mostly operating in a COVID sort of regime. So lots of doors open, lots of windows open to try to sort of maximize the exchange. So here we only see a very modest enhancement in CO2 indoors because that was a COVID strategy to improve ventilation. So again, with all of this data paired with lots and lots of surveying to understand how many fans, how many windows, when are kids outside, when are they inside, to try to help make the data interpretable. As part of this, for sharing data back through reports and dashboards, we've been building things like Shiny apps. This is an example that was led by Bong Nguyen and Sarah Henderson that I participated in at the GF Strong Rehabilitation Center, where you can actually click around and see this information publicly. And also in terms of working with daycares, providing full, detailed level reports that go back to them. Each report was about 25 pages. It took a huge amount of effort to make these for each facility, but trying to provide sort of interpretable data. Here are some calendar plots. They're just showing the AQHI by different day for both their outdoor and indoor. Huge amount of information, and try to give them as well a summary of our observations, some recommendations for improvement, etc. So lots of different stuff that we've worked on. So if we bring this back again to the pillars of how the work is designed, again, in terms of data interpretation, focus here was on converting the raw low-cost sensor data into metrics that mean something. Here is in the context of modifiable factors like air exchange and ventilation, which I would argue there are a number of things that people could do to improve their air exchange and ventilation. And if they can't, we should be looking at it from a sort of building design perspective. In terms of stakeholder engagement, all of this work required building relationships with relevant regulatory agencies. For example, the daycare work was with Vancouver Coastal Health. PCCDC participated with the GF Strong study, and making sure that you're understanding their needs in addition to your own research interests, and making sure that the study participants actually get insights from participating and communicating how long it's going to take. So for example, we gave the reports back to the daycares a little bit less than a year later after we did the analysis, because it takes a lot of time to crunch all those numbers, and being transparent upfront about how long these things can take, very, very important. In terms of knowledge dissemination, again, working on building dashboards, building out participant air quality reports with context. And in terms of logistical considerations, many of the same ones I had mentioned before. I added here at the end, communicating back lead times for reporting, because it can often take graduate students, 12 to 18 months to return something back. So lots that has to go into these studies upfront, having that ongoing communication at the same time, also very, very important. So if we revisit these key considerations for a meaningful low-cost sensor deployment, this is just the same slide I had towards the beginning of the talk. We ask ourselves, okay, that's some cool stuff you showed. Where do you think you're going to go next? I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about that, or some sort of different options. One thing I'm interested in addition to this source characterization, is expanding the reach of the work via data fusion with modeling data or satellite images. So here's an example of pairing a model with low-cost sensor data, where you would start with the low-cost sensor network in the sort of top left. You have a data fusion with some models, and then you can come up with essentially more robust maps that can be linked to exposure. Very, very interesting to me. Hopefully we can do some of that work going forward. Continuing to have opportunities with these tools to respond to emergent events. The low-cost sensors with their low power demand, the large number available, and their portability, they are very well suited to respond to urgent needs. So if we consider 2020 as an example, we had a record-shattering wildfire season. in which, having access to low-cost sensors get out there. We've loaned some before to another group in UAS that's used them to try to come up for the, like Roland Stell's group, who has the smoke map to tune some of their model inputs a little bit better, get those out there to do controlled prescribed burns, getting sensors out there for air exchange rates and ventilation due to the COVID-19 pandemic. All these things, you never know what's going to arise, and having tools at your fingertips to get them out there, also very interesting. So hopefully we'll continue to get to do that important work. There are still some challenges worth looking at as well as researchers. So calibration does loom large as a big challenge. So far I've always mentioned that the current gold standard for calibration involves that partnership that I have with Metro Vancouver, right? Co-location with regulatory grade instruments. What do you do if there's no nearby co-location options, right? That's something we've been grappling with the data set that we have from India. We do have some wildfire smoke data from Vancouver, which is the same concentration ranges as what we were measuring in India, but the nature of the pollutants are quite different. And so we're trying to look at pulling in satellite data sources, extracting the regional component of the signal, kind of like the inverse of what I did with the traffic. Get rid of the local stuff, keep the regional stuff, try to build calibrations on the regional scale. I'm not sure. We're working on it. But we're hoping that we can leverage other data streams for this purpose. So can we leverage any purple air deployments? Can we leverage websites like OpenAQ that pull from regulatory monitors all over the world and now pull from some low-cost sensor networks all over the world? Can we leverage satellite data? There's some really amazing air quality satellites now, and there's some data streaming in from these. And we're wondering, how can we leverage these different tools to come up with more robust or generalizable calibration approaches? And the last and probably most important challenge is, what do we do with all of this data? So this is a figure that really spoke to me about how, not my figure, but a figure that really spoke to me about all these different sensed connected things. And the figure makes this argument that if you want to connect devices to human value, then you need to have all 6 of these elements. Device connection and connectivity, okay, that's fair. Rogers partnerships, whatever, 5G, sure. Data sensing and collecting, people are building better sensors all the time. Engineers are, great for that, technically. Data transport and access, not doing such a great job of that. Accessibility of the data has been a little bit mixed, but we've been working on those tools. Data analytics, I think we do a pretty good job of that. But these last 2, data value is actually defined by action or human values and experiences driving how these things are deployed. I'm not so sure we're doing such a great job of those elements. And so I'm trying to make sure, that any project we take on, any study we work on, is trying to be rooted in this idea of, what is it that we're actually trying to address? You will never see me proposing massively putting out a static air quality network. I'm very interested in the applications of these things, because really that's my personal goal, right? How can we connect these devices to human value? It's also lots of challenges. We've struggled. We do our best with dashboards and things, right? With knowledge transfer and community engagement. So not just me, lots of people. Increasingly, our research is in communities. This is a new area for many of us. Public trust, meaningful engagement, all these things are critical. So how do we do this? How do we get the knowledge out there? Are we budgeting resources to help with stakeholder engagement? Do we even know how to do this in a meaningful way? I don't know that I always do, but I'd like to think about who I can collaborate with, what interdisciplinary teams can we build, and what can we learn from people who've been thinking about these systems for a long time. So again, this is a very complicated figure, but it's not for you to look at. It's not my figure. But it was something, when I was looking around at this, it was like, oh, we can really learn a lot from people who've been working on these issues for a long time about how we meaningfully engage different partners and how do we achieve sort of community and system changes. So again, very complicated figure, but just sort of identifying that we don't need to start from scratch on this. We just need to build the right team. I've also tried to do some what I call sort of like low value research output, where it's not really even really research, right? It's just sort of tools and things that we've built for the community. So I've written some tutorial articles, built out some GitHub websites, made little quizzes for sensor deployment considerations. Not anything that's going to personally benefit my own research career substantially, but just because I think it's important that if you're going to do work in the community, you have to serve the community. What can you sort of report back and provide that's going to be helpful. Thinking about, different decisions you might need to make, or even how to run different R scripts if you want to process this data. So to wrap this up, I think that for enhancing our understanding of urban air quality and mitigating impact, low-cost sensors, I think they can be a useful tool. I probably should have used a stronger word than may. However, there are lots of challenges I think that are important to be aware of at the logistical, technical, and community level. And I hope I've made it clear from saying my own, challenges with these things and thoughts about these things, is that we're going to need diverse teams of researchers and training programs to implement these technologies successfully. I really admire, what you've built in IRES about emphasizing, having different people work together on these problems. I think it's exactly what we need to help make progress on these goals. So with that, I will wrap it up. I really look forward to having some great conversations today. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge, many of the fantastic collaborators that I've worked with and some of the funding agencies and partners that have made this work possible. I'll take any questions if you have them. Student questions first. I don't know. Oh, sorry. I'll repeat the question. There was a question about with the Apple weather app has the air quality data. My impression is that most of those are just based on like forecasts and models, or like sort of regional data that's available. They might be pulling from some of the published low-cost sensor network, but I don't think there's any like Apple-specific devices yet. Although they seem to be popping up all over the place. You can get things like Amazon is selling air quality sensors now. IKEA is also selling air quality sensors now. Not sure how well they perform, but my guess is probably it comes from models and other regulatory networks. Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, that's a great question. So I'll just repeat the question. Tony was asking about, how can sensors be used to support sort of better, sort of, I'll say it's sort of personalized assessments of air quality and health, so things like intake fraction, for example. I will mention that the way that we have all the examples that I've shown here are really more so focused on source characterization because they're static monitors. There are some monitors, low-cost sensors that are more so wearables that you can sort of have around with you, which will give you much more accurate assessment of, your personal air quality. I mean, if you had enough of these at scale and you knew where people were moving around, you could have a better sense of what their personal exposure would be. In terms of the size of the networks that we've deployed so far, we're not really sort of there. But I think in the sort of visioning of the healthy city of the future, if you had enough of these out there, you could probably make suggestions around routing someone in a different way to sort of reduce their air quality exposure. But I think if you wanted to know your personal, I mean, intake fraction is even complicated, right? Because you don't necessarily fully intake anything you even breathe as well, right? Because the mechanics of your nose and the particle size effects and everything. Um, but you'd probably want to rely more so on like a wearable type sensor to want to wear around. They're pretty heavy. Yeah. Oh, okay. So Lynn's question is about, what does it take, I guess, to get from the utopian or dystopian vision in which there's sensors everywhere and people can, sort of understand citizen scientists as sort of science is everywhere. People can make sort of decisions based on having all this data access versus where we are now. Did I roughly paraphrase the question? Yeah. So, I mean, this is complicated. And I think it's sort of beyond the scope of the sort of research that I do, right? I've been very intentional about application-specific deployments of sensors to better understand specific sources or specific context, because what I haven't mentioned at all is that if you're gonna deploy a low-cost sensor network in a continuous way, it's pretty much only low cost in terms of the capital. It's not so low cost in terms of the ongoing maintenance, management, calibration, drift, all of these things. So I think that, like, we'd really need to rely, my guess is that some of this will be solved by, um, like, players in the space of like edge computing and things who can sort of push calibrations out. We need that sort of thing to get there. Uh, but yeah, we have a long way to go in terms of even like managing a sensor network in an ongoing basis. If I talk to Metro Vancouver, when I talk to them, that my focus is mostly on understanding sources better so that they can maybe be inputs into models or inputs into decision making. They're like, yeah, we like that because the concept of Metro Vancouver having to maintain a low cost sensor network all the time is really daunting. They just don't have the resources to do it because it is resource intensive in terms of personnel, at least currently. So I feel like to get there, you need like probably some sort of public-private partnership to help manage this, someone managing all the data streaming in, like even for the traffic data. The reason that there's this partnership with Rogers and 5G is that essentially we're applying the calibration algorithms in real time and then applying the baseline removal algorithms and then converting the data to emission factors. And all of that takes time. And if you want to do that at scale, in real time, it really does sort of start to require this sort of like 5G type data connection. So I think it's going to involve a lot of different stakeholders getting into a room and trying to hash out, what the sort of smart city type stuff is going to look like. But I think we're a bit of a ways away from that. Yeah. Do I get to? Oh, yeah. So I'll repeat the question for those on Zoom. There is a question from Jiaying about have you done this to look at essentially linking stuff to health data so you could have early alerts, for example, if there's going to be some exposure. We have not done any linking to health data because I have I would have to defer to someone like Sarah Henderson, for example, who's epidemiologist. Um, I think, the focus so far on sort of early alerting around wildfire smoke, for example, relies on the fact that in general, wildfire smoke is pretty ubiquitous, like in terms of high spatial variability there is spatial variability due to wildfire smoke for sure, especially near the water, right? Sea breeze, that sort of thing. But I think the sort of scale of the wildfire smoke intensity, and the sort of regionalness of it is probably enough for them now to make their early alerting systems. Is it something that could be interesting to look at? I definitely think it could be interesting. I mean, there are some BC CDC and VCH purple air sort of mass deployments that are going to be happening in the next sort of year, and we're going to help them with some of the data analytics of that to see, how spatially variable is it. I think there's probably would be more interesting to look at the indoor air quality element, like if there's more infiltration of smoke into certain buildings. Could that be used for early alerting? Because right now it's all based on ambient data. It's mostly outdoor data, right? That we know concentrations are high, so be careful. But it would be really interesting to see if it's like, you have a lot more indoor sensors or indoor outdoor, you can get a sense of infiltration and people could get sort of customized alerts about that. Could be really cool, but yeah, I sort of try to stay in my lane around epidemiology because not my training at all, but interesting people I'm very interested in partnering with for sure. Sure. Let's see if I can go to 32. Whoop. Normally this works. There we go. Sorry, I should say the time series plot of CO2 is what's called a diurnal plot. So essentially it's the average by time of day. And this was for non-wildfire periods. I probably blew through this too quickly. But essentially we were just trying to understand like how good is the ventilation during wildfire versus non-wildfire periods. And particularly in 2020 or fall 2020 in these daycares, CO2 has been used all over the place as a sort of marker of the quality of the fresh air coming into the building. And because the daycares got very specific directives from Vancouver Coastal Health, it was like, try to keep all your windows open, your doors open as much as possible, maximize your outdoor playtime. We wanted to look at CO2 as a marker of, how good is the ventilation. And we certainly do see increases in CO2 during the operating hours, but it's not huge enhancements. I mean, some of the stuff you've seen on Twitter where it's like CO2 concentrations are 1,000 ppm, for example, and here we're seeing enhancements of 20 ppm. So, very essentially, I would look at this and say, it looks promising because the CO2 goes up when there are people breathing CO2 in the room. That's predicted. That's predictable. But I would say this is very well ventilated because the concentration range is not very high. So that was the focus of that. But this was not wildfire period. Only the previous plot was comparing wildfire versus non-wildfire. Yeah, so we haven't only done work around urban air quality. Like I said, we did do that sort of remote community study in India. The main reason that we mostly do urban stuff is that most of my research background is in vehicle-related emissions. All my training was in vehicle emissions, and so I've been interested in this question of vehicle emission factors and low-cost sensors for a little while. And also, we had hoped to do multiple field campaigns in India, but we did the first one in December 2019, and we haven't been able to repeat that because travel and COVID has made things essentially impossible. I'm interested in sensors applied in all sorts of ways. I think the research so far has been a little bit of a balance of my own interest and then opportunities that have come along because people have these, opportunities. They want to do work in daycares. They want to put sensors in a rehabilitation facility, and how can we partner with them? So a little bit of a balance of my own research interests and then the partners' needs as well. I certainly think there's room for lots of this work in lots of different contexts, and I all think it's very important. Yep. Yeah, so in terms of the accuracy of a low-cost sensor, it really depends on the pollutant that you're measuring. And so the US EPA puts out these sort of like different tiers of accuracy, where like tier 4 is equivalent to a regulatory monitor, and then like tier 1 is like, can you identify a hotspot? Like if there was a fire 30 feet away, would your sensor be able to sort of detect the hotspot? Um, and most of the sensors, except for like CO, for example, you can get to sort of tier 3. Ozone tier 3, NO2 tends to be a little bit worse, closer to sort of tier 2, tier 3, which they call the sort of like exposure. It's based on the amount of essentially precision and bias that is possible. For particulate matter sensors, we can see, I think our threshold for detection is roughly, we trust things over like 5 micrograms per meter cube. Below that, it gets quite noisy. Normally, the higher the concentration, the more confidence you have. So it's also a function of what the like measured concentration is, because that'll influence the accuracy as well. But yes, happy to share resources about sensor precision and accuracy. If they're interested, please tell them to email me. I could send them some resources. Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think from our perspective, what I've been interested in is like if we can use sensors to come up with robust emission factors of vehicles. Those emission factors are really important inputs into other models. Like for example, for vehicle emissions specifically, there's a model called MOVES where you can do different scenarios or change fleet mixes and things like that. And most of the emission factors are like, they're like fairly static by you can classify the vehicles into different things, but the emission factors are fairly static. And we're interested in like if we have more dynamic emission factors, or we could update these emission factors or make them more location specific. What are the implications of that? There's also a collaborator of mine, Mahmoud Fatmi, who's at UBC Okanagan, and he builds essentially agent-based models for looking at if you change certain systems around these networks of vehicles and how they move around, what the implications are. And it's really amazing because he puts all this effort into building this agent-based model for changing traffic scenarios and what it's going to mean for congestion, and then he converts it into GHG implications or air quality implications. But again, the actual emission factors are fairly static. And so we're hoping to test out what this looks like if we take emissions estimates from sensor deployments that are a little more dynamic. They have distributions. They could change over time, and what they might look like in some of these traffic and emissions models. So if we get some funding, or should find out at some point about the Climate Action and Awareness Fund, we'll probably try to do some of that work because I think it's super cool. Okay. Sure. Mhm. Yeah, I will say, so there's the question for those on Zoom was just about prescribed fires and like how you choose to get your smoke and how low-cost sensors have been used in prescribed fire context. I will say that in terms of that application, I don't have much insight. In terms of what we had lent out sensors to do was like there was a controlled prescribed burn that was happening anyway, and the research group was going to monitor at it to get, in general, better measurements of how smoke and pollutants disperse, so that they could have that as inputs for their wildfire smoke models. So it wasn't necessarily like a prescribed burn study specifically. It was like taking advantage of a prescribed burn to try to come up with more robust models of smoke dispersion and movement. But prescribed burning, very interesting question. We haven't done really any work in BC much outside of the Metro Vancouver region, but certainly something that would be like really interesting to do, especially when we have more sensors that we're going to be buying in the next couple of years. Because yeah, I would love to sort of talk with people who've done this sort of work around what their experiences of smoke have been with these different regimes, and how sensing, could help. I assume getting more indoor data, and I guess if you know the smoke is coming, you could take certain behaviors, versus if you don't know the smoke is coming, then what does it look like in terms of the indoor-outdoor ratios? Yeah. But I don't know. Something for the future. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.